but I can still hear it clawing away in the middle of the night. It emanates from the walls, it wafts up from under the floorboards, it hangs in the very air. Quiet, barely a noise at all beyond the rustling of old papers, perhaps that of a door left slightly ajar, but audible there. I know it's him, I know it's Cornelius. I have seen what he has meant for me to see. I have felt the goose flesh of his cold breath at my neck, and I know, oh God, I know, that the past never dies. I believed I could save what my family had created. I think that was an homage to them. Unless it was me, and I have just opened a door that hell knows should never be unlocked. The impetus began with a ritual I did every week anyway. Saturday morning, we all took time to dust and index the family keepsakes, most kept in my study's massive iron safe. That safe, a treasure of 19th century workmanship, one of the few things my great-grandmother had saved from the old Harper estate, Ireland. It was a hard yet secure lock that I added a 4-digit combination code that only I could enter, 37912. A set of numbers seared into my consciousness, breathed through hushed family stories and midnight confessions with my mother. Those things, which included sepia-toned pictures of my ancestors, fragile letters with beautiful looping calligraphy, and other trinkets that each had a tale to tell, had always brought me solace. I mean, I was a historian. My profession consisted of reconstructing historical events and giving long-lost tales new life. However, this was distinct. This was intimate. That first morning, I still recall realizing something was wrong. When I realized that the safe was only slightly open, just a crack, a shiver went down my spine. I hesitated, my fingers brushing across the cold metal. It was ridiculous. The house had been securely locked, and no one else has the code. However, it wasn't. I ignored the discomfort and yanked the door wide open, figuring everything would be just the way I had left it. However, it wasn't. There was a picture I had never seen before, perched on a pile of old letters. It showed a woman in front of the house I grew up in, her face hidden by shadows. Her wide-brimmed hat covered her eyes, if they were there at all, and she wore an antique gown. I felt a tingle of recognition, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I felt uneasy about the picture as I held it, like it didn't belong there. I flipped it over. A message that I didn't recognize was written in a hasty handwriting. The text said, "He's watching." My breath caught in my throat as I blinked. The ink was faded and smudged, but it still seemed unsettlingly fresh. After closing the safe and making sure the lock was tight, I convinced myself it was nothing more than an old photo that had possibly gotten in over time or a forgotten message. However, the discomfort persisted, sticking to me like the musty smell of old paper. Weeks passed, and the disruptions continued to get worse. Every time I opened the safe, something fresh would appear, a new letter or photograph, each one more eerie than the last. A picture of my great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Harper, standing in a room I didn't recognize, his eyes dead and sunken. A letter that started off in my mother's handwriting, but changed to a ragged, furious scrawl halfway through. The phrases were illogical and fragmented, but one phrase kept coming up that made me shudder to my core. The price must be paid. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that my mind was playing games. My oldest buddy Julian was the only one who knew about my fascination in my family's past, so I even confided in him. I told him everything over coffee at the neighborhood cafe, attempting to make it sound less crazy than it actually was. He sipped from his cup, his brow furrowed. "It's just old stuff." Perhaps there is a prank being played. As you may know, history enthusiasts and collectors can be peculiar people. I pressed, feeling my fury rising. "It's not that," I said. "These creatures shouldn't be here. Julian, I know what I have. Every bit, Every tale, I know. Furthermore, these are incorrect. Julian gave me a look that bordered on pity. Lydia, you're pushing yourself too hard. Take a rest from everything. Take a stroll and get some natural air. You're allowing this place to affect you. I nodded, but I wasn't very comforted by what he said. Something was changing in the house. I could feel it in the air. Lying in bed and listening to the ancient manor's slight creaks and groans was the hardest part of the nights. It was almost as if there were whispers, too soft to hear, like voices carried by the wind. Occasionally, when I would awaken, I would discover the safe's door slightly open, and the sound of a cold, metallic click would reverberate through my deserted study. Eventually, the uneasiness overcame me one evening. With my pulse thumping fiercely, I sat up in bed and stared at the door to my study. I couldn't get rid of the sensation that someone or something was waiting inside. Snatching up my torch, I tiptoed into the pitch-black hallways, the light flickering on the old and worn decor and dusty paintings. At the door, I froze, reaching for the doorknob with a shaking hand. The study was just as I had left it, with the wide bay windows letting in plenty of moonlight. However, the safe was completely unlocked, with its contents strewn all over the floor like someone had just dug through it. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I moved closer. My breath froze in my throat. There was a note I had never seen before among the jumbled belongings. It was written in a handwriting that I recognized but was slightly off. With trembling hands, I snatched it up and read, "Lydia, you are the last. The lineage has to foot the bill he is awaiting." A chilly breeze blew through the room as I stumbled back and dropped the letter. The temperature dropped sharply, and I sensed that someone or something was keeping an eye on me from the shadows. Strange, elongated shadows were created on the walls by my torch as it flickered, and I swear I saw a figure move in the corner of my eye. Determined to discover answers, I headed directly to the local archive the following morning. Mrs. Wilcox, the archivist, gave me a knowing look when I described the modifications made to my family's artifacts. The moment I brought up Cornelius Harper, her attitude changed. She murmured, as if fearing the walls could hear, "Your great-great-grandfather. He was involved in some very dark things, Lydia. There's a reason why people don't often bring up his name. He experimented with things best left unnoticed." She took out a worn, leather-bound book and opened the pages to old newspaper clippings about Cornelius's trial, with charges of necromancy, theft, and curses on those who dared to oppose him. According to one tale, he made a deal that would haunt his successors and feed on their obsessions and phobias. It's believed that the ghosts attached to his possessions are his means of communication, Mrs. Wilcox added, her eyes flashing apprehensively. You see, he never desired to be forgotten. Lydia, you've managed to keep him alive. As I drove home, the realization bearing down on me, her words continued to reverberate in my head. I had been unwittingly the keeper of his curse, my devotion to our family's history nourishing his evil spirit. And now it was my turn to bear the consequences. The whispers got louder that night. They sounded in every nook and cranny of the house, getting louder by the second until I was hardly able to think. The floor swayed like though the house itself were alive, writhing in agony, and the walls felt as though they were closing in on me. With my gaze locked on the safe, I staggered into the study. It was open, and the things inside had arranged themselves into the most hideous shape, resembling a man, a figure I was all too familiar with. Cornelius, his dark, hungry, and hateful eyes were staring back at me from the pictures. Lydia, a guttural, deep voice muttered. With my heart pounding, I turned around to see Cornelius standing in front of me. His translucent and wavering presence seemed to be stealing the warmth from the room. "There is no way out for you." The cold ate up my voice when I tried to yell. He drew nearer, his body contorting and twisting until it was nothing more than a mass of shadows that around me and tightened like a vice. His hunger, his wrath, his never-ending want to be remembered flooded back to me. I could feel the icy talons of his spirit creeping into my own being as my vision became fuzzy. How long have I been here? I'm not sure. The murmurs never stop, and the days blend into one another. I can still see him, lurking in every reflection, every nook of my home. The heirlooms still exist, and I am ensnared in a similar fate that befell Cornelius along with them. For now, the safe remains open. I no longer bother to close it. I just can't handle it. The objects keep shifting, reorganizing themselves in ways that belittle my efforts to keep them intact. I was never honoring my family, as I now realize. I was merely an additional connector, a further container for the shadows that Cornelius had left behind. I'm alone myself too. I'm aware that the cycle will restart when someone discovers this house and me. Since the past is eternal, it observes, waits, and murmurs. The first time it happened, I felt I was going crazy. A slight flicker or glitch in the corner of my screen, nothing special, nothing that any tech-savvy person like me would dismiss. However, this wasn't a glitch. I had written a legal document the previous evening that included an additional paragraph. There was a sentence I never wrote at the very end of a straightforward contract for a well-known client. There are truths not meant to be known. Stop searching. At first, I had to chuckle since the other option was too uncomfortable. However, the document had disappeared from my hard drive and the cloud by the time I stopped laughing, as though it had never really happened. That was just the beginning. The day began as any other. The previous night, I had worked through the night to complete an article on a well-publicized data breach, a corporate disaster of the kind that typically results in several firings and enough irate emails to keep me in business for years. I wasn't a hero by any means. Simply put, I was excellent at locating items that others didn't want found. As the world outside my window gradually came to life, I drank the remainder of my cold coffee from yesterday and stared blearily at my monitor. The early hours of the day were often frighteningly silent in the jewelry quarter, with the tiny streets generally deserted except for the occasional delivery truck or jogger. When people still gave a damn about reputation and craftsmanship, my apartment was located on the top floor of a century-old building that had once been a jeweler's workshop. It was only the two of me now, along with a disorganized home office and an obstinate headache. However, there was a problem that morning. Even before I sat down at my desk, I could feel it. Perhaps it was the silence, which seemed heavier than normal and felt like a burden. Perhaps it was the way the shadows appeared to linger in my apartment's corners for a prolonged period of time, spreading out like dark tendrils across the hardwood floor. I dismissed it and returned my attention to the task at hand. There was no sign of the file I had been working on, which detailed the unethical actions of a large IT company. Not on cloud storage, not in backups, nor in the folder. The contents have changed, but the folder itself remained intact. There were pictures instead of the report I had painstakingly put together. There were many of them, files with unfamiliar names, gazing back at me from the computer. Images of locations I had never visited and never taken. Images of dark silhouettes peering straight into the lens while standing in deserted streets, varied in sharpness and blurriness. With one of them, there was what appeared to be an ancient, iron-wrought door covered with weird, mysterious markings that I was unable to understand. I sat back in my chair, feeling my heartbeat quicken. I looked over the timestamps. Days earlier, they were on a date. However, that isn't possible. I declined these. These files were never opened by me. And yet, there they were, staring me in the face like a hideous assemblage of memories that I didn't own. "Get moving, Preston," I whispered to myself. "Get a grip." But the sound of my voice did little to dispel the feeling of looming fear. I shut down the document, or I tried to, anyhow. However, the silhouette of the dark creature stayed there, still, on my screen. The figure continued to monitor me even after I hit escape and turned off the machine. The safe's door snapped open as it was across the room. When I moved in, the safe had previously existed. The previous owner had informed me that it was an antique artifact from the building's glory days. All steel, no contemporary electronics, just a straightforward lock and key system. It has never caused me any problems. I had never really utilized it. I had only kept some old files and case files, things that were too significant to discard, but not necessary enough to carry around. And yet, there it was. Open. Just open. I got up from my chair and walked over, feeling as though my legs should weigh more. The room appeared darker now, the light from the morning sun fighting to make its way through the massive windows. As I reached in and took out a few papers, my fingers brushed the chilly steel of the safe's door, only to find out that the papers aren't mine. They weren't owned by me. I dropped old newspaper clippings that had become brittle and yellowed with age. Throughout the headlines, Oliver Kinnick was written in bold characters. A journalist, someone who had disappeared more than 30 years prior. Although the specifics were unclear, he had been looking into a cult or covert organization of some sort. His remains were never located. I had no idea why I was drawn to take a closer look. Kinnick has been out of my mind for a long time. To be honest, I had no idea how those newspaper articles got into my safe. But a cold feeling came over me as I skimmed the papers. All of them indicated that Kinnick had discovered something he wasn't meant to. Decades later, I was starting to question if I had discovered the same thing. My apartment's shadows appeared to move once more, getting closer. Abruptly realizing the room was suddenly quiet, I dropped the papers and took a step back. My own strained and weak breathing was the sole sound. I turned to look at my computer screen again, half expecting to see that dark figure still there, but all I saw was a dead, black monitor. Something rumbled behind me. The odd events persisted for several more days, things that defied logic, like the files on my computer and the safe that opened and closed by itself. At first, I tried to dismiss it, blaming it on stress, exhaustion, or perhaps a glitch in the system. But I knew in my heart that wasn't the case. Every morning, I'd wake to find additional files in my safe, documents, images, recordings, all tied to Kinnick's case. The pictures on my computer were more vivid, more eerie. It was as though the shadows in the pictures were attempting to draw me into the picture. Afterward, there were the emblems. They began to show up everywhere, scribbled on old documents, in the corners of pictures, and even etched into the surface of my desk when I woke up one morning. Though I was unable to read them, I could sense their significance in my gut. They served as cautions, signals to halt. Before it was too late, there were cautions to leave this alone. I couldn't stop, though, not right now, not with everything so close to me. I could sense something, but I wasn't sure what. There was a link between what was occurring to me right now and Kinnick's disappearance. Something enigmatic, something perilous, something that resisted discovery. One night, when I heard the muttering, it was the last straw. It began softly, hardly perceptible at first, like the far-off hum of a TV left on in another room. But as the hours passed, the sound got louder, more insistent. My flat was filled with voices I didn't recognize, speaking in a language I didn't comprehend. I looked in the safe. Of course, it was open once more. I discovered a single picture within. It was the kind you would imagine from the early 1900s, old and black and white. I noticed a man there who was waiting for a door, the same door that I saw in my computer's pictures, and even though the shadows covered much of his face, I could make out enough of his identity. It was me. From then on, the whispers were a constant companion. Even when I was out on the street and surrounded by people, I could hear them whether I was working or attempting to fall asleep. They never gave up and never gave in. They were constantly there, in the background, and every day they got louder. Then I realized what I needed to do. I needed to locate Kinnick. I needed to know the reality. I poured days into going through the old clippings, tracing the same path that Kinnick had taken years before. It took me to an old, standing, long-abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The location was deserted now, forgotten by time and development, where it had previously been a warehouse. I would find my answers there, and it was where Kinnick had disappeared. The air was heavy with dust when I got there, and every breath I took carried the stench of rotting. I entered, and my torch shone through the shadows, revealing the corroded remnants of long-abandoned machinery. However, that wasn't what caught my eye. The door stood at the far end of the room, almost obscured by rubble. The door seen in the pictures. The identical door shown in the safe image. The same mysterious markings that I had been seeing for weeks covered its iron surface. I couldn't decipher their meaning, but I could understand their purpose. With my heart racing in my chest, I took a step closer. The sound of the whispering was overwhelming me now, like a choir of voices shoving me in the direction of the door. My fingers brushed the cool iron as I extended my reach. The door opened with a squeak, and the shadows beckoned me closer. A week later, they discovered my flat was empty. The safe was open, but within there was nothing except dust. My computer had been completely cleared of all files. I had left. A picture was the last thing anyone saw of me. It was sent to the editor of the newspaper I used to write for in secret. I was standing in front of an iron door in it, the shadows hiding my face. They also say that you can just make out the shape of another man behind me, grinning. I never had a cause to believe in curses or spirits. My life was logical, quantifiable, and based on facts and figures. However, as often happens, statistics are not always reliable. They have the ability to contort into patterns and configurations that defy comprehension. And once they begin, it's impossible to turn away. You can no longer rely on them, in the same way that you can't rely on the faces of others nearby as they start to alter. I had the incorrect idea that I could solve this. I was mistaken to believe I could get out of it. What has been written cannot be changed. The identity of the person holding the pen eluded me. A certain tranquility prevails. When all the numbers match, the sums add up just as they should. That's the reason I initially selected accounting. Everything was predictable and made sense. However, it is no longer the case. I was looking at a spreadsheet at my desk when I first spotted it. It was just another late night spent attempting to wrap up the monthly accounting for Stern & Vale, a company located in the tall financial area of Eldoria. Incorrect decimal point was used. Even though it was a tiny error that hardly registered, I was stuck with it. A cent had been added to the quarterly profits figure, which had not been there previously. Better off letting things go. I could have written it off as a simple error in data entry. However, I didn't, because something else drew my attention as I gazed at that insignificant mistake. Beneath it was a row of numbers that made no sense. They weren't financial gains, they weren't defeats, there was nothing at all. I scowled. The inclusion of dates made no sense. Not only were they not in the proper format, 1827, 1932, 1974. I was unable to turn away, even though the rest was a haze. With a sharp blink, I massaged my eyes as the screen seared into my retinas. The dates were gone when I opened them again. After the numbers had adjusted on their own, everything returned to normal. The quarterly earnings were in line with expectations. Just the figures. It wasn't normal though, not at all. As I adjusted my suit jacket in front of the hallway mirror the following morning, I sensed another unsettling feeling. As usual, I looked into my mirror and saw my dark brown hair pulled back, my eyes heavy with fatigue, and the gentle wrinkles on my face more pronounced due to years of staying up late. However, I paused due to something in the background. The family portrait on the wall, the one shot years ago at a beach in Nice. I had witnessed it countless times. All right, something wasn't right today. My mother wasn't the woman standing next to my father. My heart was racing. Towards the picture, I moved closer, gasping for air. I was positive the longer I glanced at it, even though it was slight and nearly invisible. Her face appeared somewhat blurry, as if someone had tainted the picture. Her features were twisted but recognizable. Somehow twisted. I traced the contours of her face with my fingers, feeling my pulse in my temples. Her gaze was fixed on me. They were, I promise, observing yet failing to see. "How in the world?" I retreated, muttering. I blinked once more. Suddenly, the face belonged to my mother once more. Was I dreaming, overtired? I considered the idea, but a deeper part of me disapproved of it. No, there was a happening. I could sense something, but I wasn't sure what. A nagging feeling of fear seeped into my being. I didn't even know what the questions were yet, but I needed answers. I was at work when it happened again. As usual, I had arrived late for a client meeting and made my way straight to my office. I was completely stopped in my tracks when I came in. The safe, which I always kept closed, was left open. No, it is not possible. That day, I hadn't touched it. I took a step forward and looked around the room, breathing harder. No evidence of forced entry was present. With its contents, sensitive files and vital documents, scattered all over the floor, the safe door hung slightly ajar. Anxiety erupted throughout me. I knelt down and began leafing through the documents. Everything was in its place. There was nothing lacking. However, everything was incorrect. Where I had left the documents, everything had been rearranged. Several were folded in ways I would never have folded them, and several were folded upside down. As I took up one of the papers, a deed from a long-forgotten real estate acquisition my family had done decades earlier, my hands shook. I was no longer even sure why I had retained it. However, as I turned the pages, my attention was drawn to something. A name I was unfamiliar with. Victor Celine. My father didn't go by that name. My mother didn't go by that name. No one in my family was involved. And yet, there it was, dated 1974, signed in neat script at the bottom of the page, just like the figures in my spreadsheet. The days that followed were a haze. I spent every free moment searching through ancient records for a link between this Victor Celine and my family. I flipped my flat upside down, old letters, tax records, photos, but nothing fit. However, his name would always be there, looming in the backdrop, whenever I discovered something new. Financial statements, deeds signed, even private letters to my father. It was as though he had been lurking in the background of my existence the entire time, out of sight. Then the phone calls began. They seemed like spam at first because there was no one on the other end and the numbers were random. But late one night, as I sat at my computer, weary and on edge, the phone rang again. I was hesitant to pick up. "Hey?" Silence. Then came a voice, measured, quiet, almost too calm. "Nikita Blake, something extremely valuable has been left to you. something you were not told about by your relatives. However, it's now necessary for you to pay back your debt." I went cold, my blood became icy. "What debt?" My speech trailed off. "You'll discover soon enough. I advise you to pay careful attention to the numbers you have. They are merely the start." What happened was a nightmare come true for me. The abnormalities in my paperwork, images, and data that had started earlier were getting worse. Things weren't right everywhere I looked. Too long, faces in crowds staring at me were strangers. When there was no one around, shadows moved. The creaking in my flat felt like there was life watching me from behind the walls. Furthermore, additional papers had been transferred each time I checked the safe. My thoughts were disintegrating, akin to a taut thread. I had lost all sense of what was true and who to believe. It was also observed by my colleagues. My formerly perfect work started to falter. I neglected to meet deadlines. I started to make errors. I knew what the partners in the firm were talking about while they were speaking behind closed doors. "She's going crazy. She lacks stability." But they were in the dark. It was beyond their comprehension. I wasn't insane. They were pursuing me. I was being hunted. When I discovered the ledger, it was the last straw. A worn-out leather book nestled behind a loose panel in the safe's back had a secret. Names, dates, and numbers abound throughout its pages, accounts dating back several centuries. Every name has a numerical value. Each number corresponds to a loan. And there at the top was the name of my family. I comprehended more as I read more. Generations ago, my family struck a deal with something much more sinister than wealth or influence. They had surrendered to the ledger, a sentient entity that warped reality and consumed the minds and lives of those under its control. It had finally arrived for me. I made an attempt to flee. After getting ready and leaving my flat, I purchased a one-way ticket out of Eldoria. However, my heart stopped when I gazed out the window as the plane lifted off the ground. Below me, the city was gone. All that was seen was unending darkness that stretched out in all directions like ink smeared across a page. I was confined. Everything had been rewritten by the ledger. It said that numbers don't lie. However, they do. They bend, twist, and distort reality to suit their needs. Now that I know that. The ledger cannot be avoided. There is no way out of the debt my family has. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. Everywhere I look, there are numbers waiting for me to trip and fall. And they'll come get you too once I do.